So, welcome to this Good News Church. I'm so happy to see all of you. And maybe some of you already know that we have a little campaign in our church. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to all, as a church, start studying Book of Mark. It's a wonderful gospel. First of all, because it's probably the shortest. So for the younger audience, it's going to be fast. But besides that it's the shortest, it has the most action. So you should be excited about that too. Another good thing about this book is that it's chronological. So in case you forget and you need to kind of go back and see the sequence of events, this is a good book to follow. You go back and read through this. But the most important, it's the book that presents the person and the teaching of Jesus. Somebody once said that tough times raise tough generation. But tough generation brings good times. But those good times, they raise weak generation. And you know what? When I'm reading Book of Mark, and I see all the wonderful examples that Jesus gave us, all the actions, my biggest question to my future generation that's sitting here in front of us, maybe some in the back, is that we set up a good example of the same action that they could follow. I want to make sure that my kids growing up without even experiencing a tough times are able to see what a benefit it is to work for our Father in heaven. There is one passage in Mark that summarizes it all, that says, "For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." He already sets up an example that we as Christians, we're supposed to serve. He gives us the good news. He gives us the gospel. But just because we read the gospel, it doesn't mean that we have the gospel. And that's a big, big difference. You know, nowadays, there's so many smart people. We have so many books. We have so many online teachings. We have universities upon universities, theology colleges that could, in instance, give you all the knowledge about our Christ, about our Father in heaven. But just because you know who he is, just because you know and you've read it all, it doesn't mean that you have the gospel. And we will see it. I want to encourage, especially the young audience, that when I read the following monologue, that you remember one. Something has to happen in your life before you have the gospel. Just because you hold the book in your hands, it does not mean that you possess the good news. A lot of people can tell you about the good news, but if I don't see it in your action, it means nothing. And I think Mark does it wonderfully. In all the events that are happening, when Jesus does one thing and another, he explains what gospel is all about, what good news is all about. And I know Said is going to do a much better job going through Mark today and presenting it in probably a clearer way than I ever do. I want to leave you with the following monologue. And I also would like to encourage you, maybe pause whatever you do, whatever you think about. Close your eyes if you have to. And think about the good news. And do you really have that good news? Why is a dead Jesus good news? How could he who died bring a gospel? That's a puzzle people were trying to solve, at least the people who follow Jesus. And Mark wrote this book to help them put together those pieces. For Mark's thesis, that this gospel proves is that Jesus' death is actually good news. And Mark brought people to this conclusion by writing down that Jesus did through the truth he taught and the chains he loosened, through the power he fought and the ailment he ruined. When Jesus talked to people, he often talked about God's kingdom. It's all about the peaceful rule of heaven he would soon bring to them. But mixed into his conversations, transcripts were also prediction about his own crucifixion. The speeches that Mark's gospel includes are meant to prepare us for death of Jesus and how it is good news. When Jesus spoke forgiveness, it's like he was visiting inmates in prison. Like when he healed the paralytics, to show the skeptics that the real prison isn't any kind of sickness, but the true imprisonment is to sin in its punishment. So in each instance of the miraculous, when Jesus conquered someone's brokenness, Mark is trying to show us that Jesus has the authority to forgiveness. And that his cross is good news. His death could accomplish it. When Jesus drove out of demon, he was proclaiming the coming of the kingdom, but taking territory ruled by the enemy's religion. He was showing how he would take those under enemy occupation and free them. And when Jesus brought his freedom, it was a depiction of what he would do through his crucifixion. When he was bringing us liberation from enemies' greatest weapon, which is sin and its condemnation. When Jesus healed the sick, he brought health to unwell. He was showing how he would not only cure the symptoms of the grave, but he would heal death itself. When he cleansed the leper or raised the daughter from her deathbed, he was pointing to the healing that would come from his own death and resurrection. That is why Jesus dying is good news. And that's how he would bring the gospel. But strangely, when people caught a vision of Jesus and who he was, like when he gave the sight to sightless or life to lifeless, Jesus commanded them to silence. But why this quietness? Why should this story be declared? If this gospel is good, if this gospel is news, isn't this gospel supposed to be shared? Yes, but not yet. Because everything Mark recorded pointed forward to the cross, the gospel event. So Jesus commanded them to silence because they did not have good news yet. For something else had to happen first, which all action foreshadow and described. Jesus had to be handed over to the scribes and the chief priests, and then by the Romans be crucified. But on the way to the cross, Jesus identified with those he taught, forgave, freed, and vivified, made them new. On his way to death, he put himself in the place of those he served during his life. The king was betrayed and arrested, though we were the one who committed the crimes. He was put through the false trial, which should have been our own, but he was condemned so he could forgive those who earned the sentence which he freely chose. He who went to the spiritually possessed and freed them was himself treated like a madman. He was mocked for having no power, having no kingdom. He has all sovereignty, was stuck by earthly authority, so he might fight spiritual power and beat them. And finally, he was taken outside the city where he would give his life as a ransom for many. For the sickness he altered and took in his flesh. The enemies he conquered, he no longer suppressed. The forgiveness he offered, he paid for the debt. The kingdom he fostered, he brought through his death. And until this happened, no one, and I say no one, had good news yet. So why is the dead Jesus part of the gospel? How could he who died bring good news? Well, it's because without his death, we stand accused, but by his death, we are made new. That's why Mark wants us to see in the death of Jesus that his cross was all a part of God's plan to free us. But Jesus dying is not by itself as a good news. The gospel is not just that he went to die. So for the ending of Mark makes it clear that if Jesus only died, we still don't have good news yet. For its end with women visiting the place Jesus was laid to rest. But they did not see Jesus at the grave. They only meant an angelic witness. So by leaving us there at the site where Jesus died, with the women silent, terrified, and confused, there seemed to be a question Mark leaves behind at his gospel conclusion. After seeing all Jesus did and all his work pointed to, Mark leaves us with the death of Jesus, and it seems to ask, do you believe this is good news? Amen.